Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are tackling this rather tense situation that's been unfolding between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Mm-hmm.
It's been all over the news.
It certainly has.
So for our listeners who might not be, totally up to speed, we are talking about this kind of confrontation that happened between Trump and Zelensky at the White House.
Yeah.
And what makes it, even more kind of explosive is that it's all happening in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Right.
So we're going to try and unpack all of that for you today.
Yeah.
And I guess my first question to you is, what were your kind of initial thoughts on this whole thing? I mean, it seems like the international community really pushed back against Trump on this.
Yeah, I think, it's a really fascinating situation because this isn't just a war between two nations. It's really kind of become this focal point
Yeah.
for global anxieties about, international order and the potential for a wider conflict. So when a figure like Trump, with his history of controversial statements, wades into this already tense situation, it's bound to create ripples.
Absolutely. And I mean, he didn't hold back either from what I read. He really went after Zelensky, accused him of disrespecting the U.S.
Yes, and that accusation alone is really significant, It suggests that he's framing the conflict in very personal terms, almost as a slight against him,
Right.
rather than focusing on the broader kind of geopolitical issues at play.
Yeah, it's like his ego is involved or something.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of that.
So Zelensky didn't just sit back and take it either.
No, not at all.
I mean, he took to social media thanking allies for their support,
Right.
which I think really kind of galvanized the international community.
Exactly. It's almost like by publicly acknowledging the support of other nations, he was implicitly calling out Trump's stance and framing it as out of step with this global consensus that's formed.
Oh, interesting. So let's talk about that consensus because, Europe in particular has really been united in supporting Zelensky, which I found really interesting.
Yeah.
You've got big names, EU leaders like Antonio Costa, Ursula von der Leyen, saying things like, you're never alone, pledging to continue working with him for a just and lasting peace.
And it's not just words. I mean, they've backed it up with actions like sanctions against Russia, military aid to Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that this level of unity from Europe, especially when it comes to pushing back against the U.S., is pretty rare.
Yeah, that was my thought too.
So it does raise the question, are we seeing some kind of shift in the power dynamics between the U.S. and Europe?
That's what I was thinking, are we seeing a change
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider.
in how, these two major players interact on the world stage?
Yeah, maybe Europe's becoming more assertive, less willing to just follow the U.S.'s lead.
I mean, because it makes you wonder too, is this the beginning of a more multipolar world where power is more distributed?
Right. It's a really fascinating question.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have the answer yet.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you have Germany, which I think is really interesting because they have this historically complicated relationship with Russia.
Oh, very much so.
But they've been very firm in their support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they've used some really strong language too.
Yeah. That new age of infamy comment from Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, that was pretty powerful.
Yeah. I mean, especially coming from Germany, why do you think they chose that specific phrase? It's pretty loaded, isn't it?
It's incredibly deliberate, Given Germany's history, especially World War II,
Right.
using a term like infamy carries a lot of weight.
It does. It does.
They're basically drawing this direct parallel between Russia's actions in Ukraine and the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's a powerful statement.
And it's a message to the international community, too, I think, that they're not afraid to take a moral stand,
Absolutely.
even if it, risks their relationship with Russia.
They're not mincing words, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And they're making it clear that they view this conflict as a fundamental threat to the international order.
Yeah. And it's not just Baerbock. I mean, we've got Friedrich Merz, who's probably going to be the next chancellor,
Mm-hmm.
saying, we must never confuse the aggressor and the victim in this terrible war.
Yeah.
Even outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz has voiced his support for Ukraine. So it seems like Germany's pretty united on this.
Yeah, it's a clear rebuke of those who try to downplay or justify Russia's aggression, that's for sure.
So, okay, we've got this pretty strong unified front in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have this outlier, Hungary, who's actually come out in support of Trump.
Right.
And it's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who actually has close ties to both Trump and Putin, right?
Yes, he does.
And he's actually praised Trump, saying, yeah, that he's standing bravely for peace, and even said that strong men make peace, weak men make war.
It's a pretty provocative statement, isn't it?
It is. It is. So, I mean, what do you make of Orban kind of taking this stance, considering, his relationships with both of them?
It's a complicated situation. On the one hand, his statement seems to align with his own brand of politics, which, emphasizes strong leadership
Yeah.
and this willingness to kind of defy conventional norms.
Right. So maybe he's just playing to his base.
It's possible.
Or is there more to it?
Well, I mean, you also have to consider the ties to Putin, right? Hungary is very dependent on Russian energy.
Right.
And Orban's been cultivating this relationship with Putin for years.
So it's probably a mix of things, right?
It's likely a combination of political calculations and, economic pragmatism.
Yeah, it sounds like he's trying to walk this tightrope
He is.
between, maintaining his relationship with Putin, but also aligning himself with Trump's, worldview, which is a delicate balancing act.
It is, and it could have some serious consequences for Hungary's relationship with the rest of Europe, which is firmly, behind Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a situation to watch.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a pretty divided Europe here.
We do.
How about the rest of the world? I mean, how have other countries reacted to this whole clash between Trump and Zelensky?
Well, there seems to be this kind of common thread running through a lot of the responses, and that's a strong call for diplomacy
Yeah.
and a commitment to keep supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, like Italy's called for an urgent summit
Right.
to address the war and figure out a path towards peace.
Exactly.
And then you've got other countries like the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, even Australia, New Zealand.
They've all come out and reaffirmed their support for Ukraine.
Yeah, and it almost seems like, they feel the need to really double down on that commitment,
Yeah.
especially after seeing what Trump's done.
Yeah, it's like his stance has kind of backfired in a way,
Yeah.
Instead of weakening international support for Ukraine,
Right.
it's actually had the opposite effect.
He's kind of united the rest of the world against him.
It seems that way.
Interesting. So what about Russia? How have they responded to all of this?
Well, unsurprisingly, they've tried to downplay the significance of Zelensky's visit and the support he's received.
Okay.
They've called his trip to the White House a failure and accused him of being obsessed with continuing the fighting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, classic kind of deflecting blame.
It sounds like they're trying to control the narrative,
They are.
make Zelensky look like he's the one who's preventing peace.
Exactly. Trying to portray themselves as the reasonable party, the ones who are actually interested in ending the conflict.
So they're kind of shifting the blame, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
But what's interesting to me is that even with all of this going on, this pressure from Russia, this controversy with Trump, Ukraine itself seems remarkably unified.
Yeah, it's really remarkable considering the circumstances.
Yeah.
You've got the Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, emphasizing the need for guaranteed peace, right? He's argued that a ceasefire without guarantees is the way to Russian occupation of the entire European continent.
Right. So they're not just going to, give in.
Exactly. They're not naive.
Yeah.
And then you've got this really unusual statement from the army chief, Alexander Syrsky, who rarely gets involved in politics, but he came out and voiced his support for Zelensky, called for national unity.
I mean, that's got to be significant, right?
It is. It shows that even the military, which, is often seen as apolitical, is aligning itself with Zelensky
Wow.
in this moment of crisis.
So really sending a message.
Yeah, it's a powerful message to Russia and to the world that Ukraine is determined to defend its sovereignty.
Yeah, it really speaks to the resilience of the Ukrainian people, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, they're facing all this pressure from multiple sides, yet they remain united.
It's a testament to their courage and their belief in their cause.
Absolutely.
It's really inspiring.
It is. It is. But unfortunately, the same can't be said for the U.S., right?
No, not really.
I mean, back home, the political landscape is completely different.
Yeah, very divided.
Democrats are accusing Trump and Vance of basically doing Putin's work.
Yeah, and that division, it's not just a domestic issue,
Right.
It has implications for America's standing in the world.
So it weakens our ability to lead.
Exactly.
That's what I was thinking.
When a country is seen as divided, uncertain, it undermines its credibility,
Makes sense.
its ability to influence things on the world stage.
And especially with elections coming up.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes it even more concerning, doesn't it?
It does, because depending on who wins, we could see a huge shift
Yeah.
in how the U.S. approaches this war.
Right, and its role in global affairs.
Exactly.
Wow, so this whole clash between Trump and Zelensky, I mean, it's really become like this microcosm
It has.
of the bigger geopolitical tensions
It's a very astute observation.
and all the uncertainty that's out there in the world right now.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I do want to touch on Japan's response because it seems kind of different
It is.
from what we've been talking about.
Yeah, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has called for diplomacy backed by compassion and patience,
Right.
which is, quite a contrast to that heated exchange between Trump and Zelensky.
Yeah, like he's advocating for a more nuanced approach
Yeah,
that recognizes the complexities
he is.
and emphasizes dialogue and understanding.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Amidst all the, the heated rhetoric, the political maneuvering.
Yeah.
Ishiba's statement is a reminder that ultimately
Yeah.
finding a lasting solution to this conflict,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to require compassion, patience, and a willingness to engage in meaningful dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
It's something we should all keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure. So as we've seen, this clash between Trump and Zelensky, I mean, it's triggered all these reactions across the globe.
It really has.
It's become this focal point for all this international anxiety, really highlighting the deep divisions and uncertainty surrounding this war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is. We've covered a lot of ground here,
Hmm.
but there's still so much more to unpack.
There is.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to delve even deeper into the potential consequences of all of this
Okay.
and explore what it means for the future of global politics.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned.
It's certainly been revealing, hasn't it, this whole clash? I mean, it's really exposed the fault lines in the international order and brought the complexities of this conflict into sharp relief.
Yeah, it's given us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah.
What I keep coming back to is, where do we go from here? I mean, has this made a peaceful resolution even less likely now?
It's hard to say for certain, but it's definitely made the path to peace a lot more challenging. The erosion of trust between the U.S. and its allies, the emboldening of Russia, the heightened tensions, it all adds up to a much less stable environment.
Yeah, it feels like everyone is trying to figure out their role in all of this.
Yeah.
Like Europe's trying to assert its independence, Russia's playing its cards, and the rest of the world's just watching anxiously.
It is a delicate dance, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely.
The outcome of this conflict will have huge consequences for the global order.
Yeah, and the actions of key players like the U.S. will be crucial.
Absolutely.
We've talked a lot about the global implications, but we haven't really touched on what this all means for the U.S. domestically.
Right.
How do you see this clash playing out in our political landscape, especially with elections coming up?
Oh, it's going to be a major talking point, that's for sure. The divisions we're seeing now with Democrats accusing Trump and Vance of siding with Putin, those are only going to intensify
Yeah.
as the campaigns heat up, This could further polarize the electorate and make it even more difficult to find any kind of common ground when it comes to foreign policy.
So this could impact U.S. foreign policy in the long term.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the outcome of the elections will have a huge impact on the direction of U.S. foreign policy, that's for sure.
Right.
Depending on who wins, we could see a significant shift in how the U.S. approaches this war and its role on the global stage.
Okay, so as we watch all of this unfold, what should we be paying attention to? What are the key factors that will determine how this plays out?
Well, first and foremost, we need to keep a close eye on the situation on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The military dynamics are constantly evolving. Any major shift could have a ripple effect on the whole political landscape.
Right.
For example, a significant Ukrainian counteroffensive that could embolden their allies and increase pressure on Russia to negotiate. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
But on the other hand, a major Russian advance could have the opposite effect. Strengthen Putin's position and make a negotiated settlement even more difficult.
So even with all the politics happening,
Yeah,
the fighting is still the most important factor.
absolutely. The war is the root of this entire situation.
Right.
Any progress towards a ceasefire or any escalation in the fighting, it's going to have a major impact on everything else.
Okay, so we've got the military situation. What else?
Well, the diplomatic efforts are crucial too,
Right.
We need to pay attention to any attempts at negotiations, whether they involve the U.S., Europe, or other key players.
Okay.
There's a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy happening, and those efforts are often just as important as the military actions.
It's like there are all these different levels to this conflict,
There
each
are.
one influencing the others.
Exactly. It's like a giant chessboard with all these different pieces moving and interacting.
And to understand it,
Yeah,
we need to be looking at all these factors
we do.
and how they interact.
It's a complex, that's for sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that internal politics within the U.S. are impacting things.
Mm-hmm.
What about Russia? Does their internal situation matter as well?
Oh, absolutely. Any instability, any political shifts within Russia, that could also influence their approach to the war.
Okay.
For example, if Putin were to face serious domestic opposition or a challenge to his leadership,
Right.
that could weaken his position, make him more willing to negotiate a settlement.
So it feels like we're at this turning point.
We are.
This clash between Trump and Zelensky has brought all these tensions to the surface and forced everyone to kind of reevaluate where they stand.
I agree. It's a critical juncture, and the decisions that are made in the coming weeks and months, I mean, they'll have a lasting impact on the future of Ukraine.
Yeah.
The relationship between the U.S. and its allies, the global order as a whole.
This has been really helpful in kind of unpacking all of this.
Yeah, and I'm glad.
I have a much better understanding now
Hmm.
of how all the pieces fit together.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But it's important to stay informed and engaged, especially in times like these.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what's the next chapter in this whole saga?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
The only thing we know for sure is that the situation is still really volatile.
Yeah,
The stakes are incredibly high.
for sure.
The actions of key players like the U.S., the outcome of those diplomatic efforts we talked about, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, they will all play a role in determining how this ultimately plays out.
It's definitely a situation that demands our attention
It
and
just,
careful consideration.
yeah, and as we've discussed, the role of the U.S. is especially crucial.
Absolutely.
The U.S. has a responsibility to act as a leader, a force for stability in the world.
Yeah.
And in this particular conflict, its actions will have a significant impact, on the lives of millions of people,
Yeah.
the future of global security.
So what do you think, listener? What role should the U.S. play in trying to find a resolution to this war? It's a tough question. No easy answers.
No easy answers, that's for sure.
But it's one we all need to be thinking about. How do you think this division within the U.S. impacts its ability to lead on the world stage? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
We've talked about the global implications, the potential consequences, the different perspectives at play.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is, but as we move forward, it's important to remember the human element at the heart of this conflict.
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitics of it all and forget that there are real people whose lives have been turned upside down.
Exactly. I mean, at the heart of this conflict are real people
Right.
whose lives have been completely upended by war.
Yeah.
Families displaced, soldiers fighting for their lives, civilians caught in the crossfire.
It's hard to even imagine.
As you continue to follow this story, I really encourage you to remember the human faces behind the headlines.
That's a powerful reminder.
It is.
It's so easy to get caught up in the abstract,
Yeah.
but ultimately these global events have very real consequences.
Very real and very human consequences.
It's a good point to end on. Yeah, it really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It did.
Like, we can talk about all the politics and the global implications and all of that, but at the end of the day, it's real people who are suffering because of this war.
Absolutely. The human cost is immeasurable.
So we've talked about the clash, the reactions, the consequences, the human element, but what I keep thinking about is, what does all of this mean for the average person?
Right.
You know, someone who's not a foreign policy expert,
Yeah.
but is trying to understand what's happening in the world.
I think the main takeaway here is that we're living in a world that's more interconnected than ever before. What happens in one part of the world, like Ukraine, it doesn't stay there. It has ripple effects everywhere.
Right, so even if it feels far away,
Yeah.
it actually affects us all in some way.
Exactly. It impacts everything: energy prices, political stability, you name it.
So we can't afford to ignore what's happening in the world.
We can't. We have to stay informed and engaged.
But what about people who feel overwhelmed by it all? You know, there's so much information out there, it can be hard to know where to start.
That's true, but I think the key is to focus on what interests you.
Okay.
What aspects of this conflict grab your attention? What questions do you have? Don't be afraid to really delve into those areas.
And there are so many resources available to help people learn more.
There are?
We'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
Yeah, and don't just rely on one source, you know?
Yeah,
Seek out different perspectives, read articles from various outlets, listen to other podcasts, talk to people who have different views.
it's all about being an active participant in
Mhm.
trying to understand the world.
Exactly.
And it's not just about acquiring knowledge, it's about using that knowledge to actually make a difference.
Right, to make informed decisions and take meaningful action.
So what kind of actions can people take? I mean, it's easy to feel like these global issues are so big that there's nothing one person can do.
I understand that feeling, but it's not true.
Okay.
There are actually many ways to get involved, even at a local level.
Like what?
You could support organizations providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine,
Okay.
advocate for policies that promote peace and diplomacy,
Mhm.
or even just talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Right. Raise awareness.
Yeah, promote understanding.
Contribute to a more peaceful world in whatever way we can.
Exactly. Even small actions can make a difference.
I think that's a great message to end on.
I think so too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really insightful conversation.
It has.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We encourage you to check out the show notes for all the sources we used.
Yes, definitely do that.
And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter to you.